morning we're pleased to have our provost, Dr. Doug McConnell, with us to bring greetings from the seminary.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you do bring those parking tickets, and we're going to charge Brad. It's an absolute delight to have you here. Some of us are old enough to where a 50th anniversary was a good year. We remember it well. Others of us are looking forward to that and thinking, oh my gosh, 50 years, what an amazing time. But we have the opportunity to celebrate the work of God in this seminary through the School of Psychology, and it's just so remarkable. Last night, my heart was moved so deeply by what God has accomplished through the School of Psychology here. Fuller Theological Seminary is committed to looking at what God is doing and how God is paying attention to the world, and we want to embody that in our students. We want to think through that. And the beautiful thing about psychology, so visibly seen in the cross in the middle of the symbol for psychology, and now you're knowing I'm blanking on my Greek, well, I can do it in Hebrew. Let's see. Okay, anyway, it's such an amazing reality for a seminary, and we're just so glad you're here. We're glad about all that's going on. We're looking forward to the continuing things that are shared and the insights. We thank you for those of you who are preparing and speaking. So welcome to seminary. Welcome to Fuller Theological Seminary. For those of you that are alum, welcome back. I hope you have a good day.
So this morning I will re-invite Dr. Beck to come and share his second lecture. He did a wonderful job with us yesterday. It was a little bit like an episode of Lost, where he kept you hanging, and you weren't quite sure what was behind the door or underground, or I didn't actually watch Lost, so I'm making that all up. But Dr. Beck, if you didn't get to hear him yesterday, he is professor of psychology at Abilene Christian University. He is the author of 3 books, Unclean, The Authenticity of Faith, and The Slavery of Death. He also writes daily about the intersections of Christian theology and psychology in his award-winning blog, Experimental Theology. Some of you may have discovered the Whiffenstock Archives book table out there. We've already sold out of all of Dr. Beck's books, and there's a number of books from our faculty. But really good news, John Whiff told me that for through the month of March, you can go online to Whiffenstock and order any of the Whiffenstock books at 40% off. Here's the trick. You need the code. The code is Archives40. Archives is the name of the bookstore, and 40 is 40% off. So you can get Dr. Beck's books, any of our faculty books, any books, theology. They have a wide variety of books there. So through the month of March, 40% off on all books there, and the code is Archives40. Dr. Beck mentioned yesterday that in some of these terror management studies, one of the things they do is they create an awareness of one's death, one's mortality. And this seems to create sorts of things happening in the person. So I thought it'd be only fair that I did that this morning with all of you. And I'd like to do that via sharing a poem. I love poetry, and I think it should be spoken out loud more frequently, and I'm in charge. This is a poem by the poet laureate, former poet laureate of the United States. Many of you will know his work, Billy Collins. And this poem is called The Dead. The dead are always looking down on us, they say, while we are putting on our shoes or making a sandwich. They are looking down through the glass-bottomed boats of heaven as they row themselves slowly through eternity. They watch the tops of our heads moving below on earth, and when we lie down in a field or on a couch, drugged perhaps by the hum of a warm afternoon, they think we are looking back at them, which makes them lift their oars and fall silent and wait like parents for us to close our eyes. Please welcome Dr. Beck.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed yesterday and all the conversation afterwards and the respondents. I'm looking forward to that again today, and all the conversation just walking around and you all stopping me and asking questions, and it's been a blessing, and I've learned a lot. That's one of the reasons I went into academia, is that I'm curious and I like to learn, and I consider myself always to be a student. And especially when you're getting into something like theology and you're trying to master a discipline that's outside your area, you can make, I've discovered, really rookie mistakes in theology. You always have this terror that you're going to say something and somebody's going to say, well, Augustine dealt with that on page 7 of the City of God. And you're like, I never really read the City of God. It seems very, very big book, and I don't really, I got things to do today. And so, anyway, you know what I'm saying? You're trying to throw out these lines across this abyss, and it's kind of foggy on that other side, the theological side, and there's experts over there, and those experts have their own hero system, not you, And what I've discovered in integration work is that I think it's good that Doug was here as the dean of the School of Theology. Is that correct? Provost now, okay. Because I think if you have hospitable people on the other side, like biblical scholars and theologians that will not shame you for making the attempt. Does that make sense? You have to, they have to go, that was a good try. But you kind of hit me in the head with the rope, and let me tie it off here. I think that's helpful, because there's something about the hero system of academia where you're trained to become the smartest person in the room. Isn't that what's supposed to happen in your thesis, your dissertation defense? You're supposed to be the expert in the room, and that's kind of the way I'm thinking about Ron and Paul. Yours formative aspects of that. That forms you to make your intellect this self-esteem marker, and so we forget to be charitable and gracious to each other and say, let me help throw ropes the other way. And I think it's the same things for theologians and biblical scholars that want to talk to us. And we treat them charitably as well. So I appreciate your intellectual hospitality as I try to make connections here. And thank you for the interest in my books. It's funny to me because the very first book I wrote was called Unclean, and I dedicated it to my wife, and she was offended. I told her, I said, I've dedicated my first book to you, sweetie. And she said, what's the name of it? I said, Unclean. It's about disgust psychology. And she didn't know quite how to get her head around that. And I ended up devoting The Slavery of Death to my parents. And they were, so I'm just really bad at that. I don't know how to dedicate it. So we'll see. Anyway, hey, thank you for coming back. I know I left you hanging, like Brad said. We kind of put you in a dark hole there. We'll climb out of it today, and we get to talk about love today. Let me say this for those of you who are clinicians. There is a conceit behind these lectures, and I should not tell you this, but there is a conceit behind it. So here is my presumption. My presumption is that if you listen to both of these lectures, that you will have before you kind of a sketch of and this is, I'm overstating this, but you're going to have a sketch of what I would think would be a psychotherapeutic orientation. Now, what I gave you last lecture was an account, a theologically informed and psychologically informed account of the origins of neuroses. So this is kind of, I'd call this kind of orientation Christian existentialism, maybe. And what I'm going to try to do today is give you an account of how neurosis might be, dare I say, treated. And I'm going to use and bring in, perhaps surprisingly, the Christian disciplines in a way that would suggest that they might be therapeutic. And so that's the conceit here, that I'm actually kind of sketching from beginning to end a whole way of thinking and conceptualizing psychotherapy from a Christian and existentialist perspective in a way that brings in the disciplines, the Christian disciplines, in a therapeutic way. And they're not just added on as Christian things on therapy, but they're actually trying to accomplish something very specific if the therapist and the client can orient them properly. So that's the conceit. If I don't accomplish that, don't hold me to that. So let's get into it. So in the last lecture, we described how our slavery to the fear of death becomes the power of the devil in our lives. And specifically, we discussed how basic and neurotic anxieties associated with death cause us to become selfish and intolerant and violent. We become selfish when we experience scarcity or lack. When we become hyper-aware of lack, we become less charitable toward others and less empathic to the demands that they place upon us. And I would, just stepping back here, I would say that happens in our nation too. Like when we go through the last recession and then we become hyper-aware of lack, we become much less charitable and hospitable to people. So think about the way anxiety infuses our conversation around something like illegal immigration. If there's not enough and we insert all these people into the workforce, there's not going to be enough for me and my family. So our hospitality reduces when we're hyper-aware of lack. We also become selfish when we pursue self-esteem in idolatrous ways, serving cultural institutions and ideologies to the point of sacrificing our friends and our family and our service to others. And we become intolerant and even violent when others, generally these cultural outsiders, threaten the values that support our self-esteem projects. So simply stated, our slavery to the fear of death impacts our ability to love others fully and sacrificially. And this is why, as I will argue in this lecture, that there is no fear in love, but that perfect love must cast out fear. And this is also why love signals our emancipation from the slavery of the fear of death and our freedom from the power of the devil. As one of the church fathers has written, the one who does not fear death is outside the tyranny of the devil. The one who does not fear death is outside the tyranny of the devil. So love thus becomes a sign of salvation and resurrection in life. As it says in 1 John 3, we know that we have passed from death to life. And we know this because we love others. Anyone who does not love remains in death. So love is the experience of resurrection and salvation. Love is the sign that we have passed from death to life. So here is the Orthodox theologian John Romanides again summarizing the dynamics between fear and sin from the last lecture and how love requires our emancipation from the slavery to the fear of death. He says, love that is free of self-interest and necessity fears nothing. Any perceived threat automatically triggers fear and uneasiness. Fear does not allow us to be perfected in love. Being under the sway of death and not having real and correct faith in God, we are anxious over everything and we are ruled by selfish bodily and psychological motives and thus unable to love unselfishly and freely. Each of us loves and has faith according to what we each perceive to be in our own or to our own advantage. Thus, we are deprived of our original destiny, and we are off the mark spiritually. In biblical language, these failures and deviations are called sins. And the fountain of our personal sin is the power of death that is in the hands of the devil and in our own willing submission to him. So salvation then is being set free from that self-interest. And the sign of our progress in this regard is the advent of love in our lives. Romanides again says, just as God above all is free of every need and self-interest, the spiritual person who has the Spirit struggles and becomes perfected in love according to Christ, love that is delivered of all need and self-interest. So now our goal in this lecture is to describe psychologically how all of that might be accomplished. How can our love be freed from, quote, need and self-interest? In light of our slavery to the fear of death, how can perfect love come to cast out fear? And then how can we, in love, move from death to life? Now, before we turn to those answers, I would like to dig a little deeper into these fears that become obstacles to love and how those fears come to shape and inform our identities. Specifically, when we think of love, the love that we are to emulate, our minds often go to Paul's encouragement in Philippians 2. Right? Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests. Right? That's being free to self-interest, not looking to your own interests, but to the interest of others. How do you do that? In your relationships with one another, have the mindset of Jesus Christ, who, being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage or something to be clung to or grasped. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking on the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness and being found in the appearance of a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. So the love we are called to emulate is this love described here, the love demonstrated by Jesus. In our relationships with each other, we are to have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. And what does that mindset involve? It involves at least two things. First, it involves a willingness to humble ourselves to take on the nature of a servant. And second, it involves a willingness to give our lives away for each other. As it says in 1 John 3:16, this is how we know what love is, that Christ laid down his life for us, and therefore we ought to lay down our lives for each other. Now, as should be obvious, in light of the last lecture, the demands of love just described here, being a servant and giving your life away, create both basic and neurotic anxiety. The basic anxiety here is obvious. Jesus died to give life to others, and we are called to follow in the footsteps of that sacrifice. Jesus said, "Greater love hath no one than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends." But those words should make us anxious. Our interests in survival and self-preservation kick in. I mean, does Jesus really mean what he says here? How literally are we to read him? The demands of love activate our basic anxieties, and our slavery to the fear of death is brought immediately back into view. In the face of this call to live sacrificially for others, how can perfect love then come to cast out this fear? Now, of course, our minds, when we think of laying down our lives for others, can race to the martyrological extremes. And no doubt there are times and places when that is what is being called for. But few of us will be faced in our lifetimes with such choices between saving our own lives and saving the lives of others. And yet I do think that these basic anxieties, these worries over self-preservation, do occur regularly in daily life. So consider the full context in 1 John 3. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay our lives down for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and truth. So note here how the martyrological ideal, Christ laid down his life for us, is connected to something, is not connected to something particularly heroic, right? Dying to save others. Jesus' death here is connected with something more mundane and workaday, just sharing material possessions with each other. This demand to lay down our lives for each other occurs in concrete actions of material sharing, and that's something we do with each other on a daily basis. That's what it looks like to take up the cross, to lay down your life for each other. This is what it looks like to die. And while that seems less extreme compared to dying a martyr's death, the basic anxieties we face here with sharing are no less real and no less acute. When you begin to fully step into this lifestyle, when you begin to share your possessions with those in need, you will quickly encounter the basic anxieties associated with self-preservation and survival. As we all know, the material needs of the world are so enormous that when we encounter them, we begin to balk at the demands they place upon us. Just how much should I give to share, to house the homeless and feed the hungry? Children starve to death today, and I bought a $4 drink at Starbucks. Should I not have given that money away? And this is what we all know. Once you begin asking questions like this, those questions never stop. There's always something more that we could have given, some other sacrifice I could have made. So where do you draw the line? I am put in mind here of the very last scene in the movie Schindler's List. After saving over 1,000 Jews by keeping them in his factory, Oskar Schindler laments at the end of the war. I could have gotten more out. I could have got more. If I had made more money, I threw away so much money. I didn't do enough. This car. Why did I keep this car? 10 people right there. 10 people. 10 more people. And this pen, 2 more people. This is gold, 2 more people. They would have at least given me one more person. I could have got one more person. And I didn't. I didn't. One more person. Listen, I think any compassionate person in a world of hunger and homelessness can identify with Schindler's Lament. This sharing with others is no easy thing. How far do we go? How far do we go in sharing and laying down our lives for others? And on the surface, it doesn't seem like sharing is cruciform or a martyrological act, but the attendant anxieties about our own well-being. If I keep giving, will there be enough for me? Will there be enough for my family? In the face of sacrificial sharing, quickly we reveal the connection of this anxiety to their fear of death. This point is powerfully made by the theologian Arthur McGill. According to McGill, when we tell others to practice a life of love, we often fail to point out the consequences of love, because love is costly. This is McGill. The love which is proclaimed in many churches carefully disregards the outcomes of love. These churches speak of love as helping others, but they ignore what helping others does to the person who loves. They ignore the fact that love is self-expenditure, a real expending, a real losing, a real deterioration of the self. And too often in our churches, we hear the gospel of love proclaimed without the gospel of need. Too often we hear the lie that to love is to help others without this help having any effect upon ourselves. My point here is that love necessarily involves sacrifices. And this is what separates love from mere charity. And yet our basic anxiety is aroused in the face of those sacrifices, causing us to pull back in the face of those demands. And here we come to see clearly why perfect love must cast out fear. A person enslaved by the fear of death will be unable to make the sacrifices that love demands. Let's turn again to Philippians 2 and the mindset of Christ Jesus. Beyond the basic anxieties we have just been discussing, the fears attendant to the call to lay down our lives for each other, neurotic anxieties are also tested by the demands of love. Recall again how neurotic anxieties manifest in the quest for self-esteem. Hungering for self-esteem, it becomes difficult for us to take on the form of a servant. Enslaved by our fear of death, we want to stand out from the crowd. We want to be noticed. We want to be praised. Consequently, Jesus demands for us to take the lowest place, crash into our neurotic anxieties. It is hard for us to be overlooked and ignored and marginalized. Consider how Jesus' demands interrupt the neurotic pursuit of self-esteem in the lives of his apostles. Luke 22. A dispute arose among them as to which of them would be regarded as the greatest. But he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles ordered over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves. So if our basic anxieties are focused on the diminishment of the physical self, our neurotic anxieties are focused on the diminishment of the ego. To become a servant like Jesus, perfect love must cast out the neurotic anxiety pushing us to become the greatest. In the words of Henry Nouwen, the downward mobility of Jesus goes against the flow of the neurotic pursuit of upward mobility that characterizes the hero system of our culture. Nouwen describing this clash. This is Nouwen. The disciple is one who follows Jesus on his downward path and thus enters with him into a new life. And the gospel radically subverts the presuppositions of our upwardly mobile society, and it is a jarring and unsettling challenge. According to Nouwen, our neurotic pursuit of upward mobility presents us with 3 great temptations. Nouwen says, the 3 temptations by which we are confronted again and again in this culture are the temptation to be relevant, the temptation to be spectacular, the temptation to be powerful. These are the sorts of things that we pursue, to be spectacular, relevant, and powerful in order to secure self-esteem. But the way of Jesus asks us to renounce those temptations, to follow the downward path of servanthood. And here's the deal, that the downward path of servanthood shakes the foundations of our self-esteem. If we pass on being spectacular, relevant, or powerful, we face the unsettling question that now one asks. Who am I when nobody pays attention, says thanks, or recognizes my work? Who are you when nobody pays attention to you, says thank you, or recognizes any of your work? Who are you? If we answer according to the hero system of our culture, the answer is crystal clear. You are nobody. At least no one of significance. And that is a source of deep neurotic anxiety. If we are not relevant, spectacular, powerful, we squarely face what Brene Brown described in the last lecture as the shame-based fear of being ordinary. I'm putting in mind here, I think, of an exhortation of St. Paul. I think in Thessalonians it says, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. That just crashes into the American, you know. I like that. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You just don't get that on a coffee mug at Mardell's. Make it your ambition. You don't hear that at graduation ceremonies, do you? The shame of being ordinary. The point of all of this is simply to say that the way of Jesus, the way of love, in addition to the basic anxieties described earlier, is a deep source of neurotic anxiety. If we pursue the downward path of servanthood, we're going to have to face the neurotic anxiety associated with being overlooked, unnoticed, and passed over. We're going to have to go without applause or praise or accolades. And that is a deeply unsettling prospect, as it makes us feel that our life doesn't matter or count in the face of death. We are tempted to feel that our lives, being ordinary and unnoticed, are meaningless. And in the face of that existential fear, we fall into the temptations of upward mobility, seeking self-esteem and the cultural heroics of trying to be spectacular and relevant and powerful. So summarizing, we've come to see why perfect love must cast out fear. Love is inhibited by both neurotic and basic anxiety. Basic anxiety interferes with love because when the sacrifices of love become too costly, we grow really anxious about self-preservation. We fear being used and expended. Neurotic anxiety interferes with love because our neurotic pursuit of self-esteem makes it difficult for us to step into the role of the servant. To be a servant is to be unnoticed, and to be unnoticed makes us wonder if our lives are significant or meaningful. So how are we to set fear free from these fears? So that's the question I'd like to now try to answer. How might we become liberated from our slavery to the fear of death, where perfect love casts out these fears? To start on that answer, I'd like to start an answer to that question. I'd like to suggest that when our lives are dominated by basic and neurotic anxiety, we have come to form our identities in a certain and a particular way. So what sort of way? A clue comes to us, again, from Philippians 2. There it says that Jesus did not consider his status with God something to be grasped or clung to. Rather, Jesus emptied himself. The Greek word here is kenosis. He empties himself. What I want to suggest here is that what we have depicted in Philippians are two different kinds of identities. One sort of identity is secured by grasping and holding on, and the other sort of identity, Jesus's, is secured paradoxically by emptying and letting go. So let's start by describing this identity based on grasping or clinging. According to the theologian Arthur McGill, our basic and neurotic fears of death cause us to configure identities in a particular way. And he calls this an identity of possession. This is an identity of ownership, territoriality, and proprietorship. This is an identity based on grasping and owning, as described here in Philippians 2. And according to McGill, this identity of possession is constructed in one of two ways. First, I might try to seize bits of the world for myself. And second, I might act in such a way that I will be proved of other persons or forces. McGill labels these two routes to identity aggression and appeasement. The former strategy roughly corresponds to our discussions about basic anxiety, when we act suspiciously or aggressively to protect what we possess from the claims of other people. The latter strategy parallels our discussions of neurotic anxiety and how we try to secure self-esteem by winning the attention and the praise of others. Both strategies are attempt to create and form an identity by possessing something, from material possessions to a social reputation. I am who I am because of what I own and control and what I possess. And yet, an identity built upon possession, material or social, is vulnerable to the forces of death, because such an identity crackles with the fear infused with worries over loss and failure and diminishment and dispossession. McGill notes, I think this is the quote, when we define our identity in terms of a reality which we can have and which we can securely label with our own name, we live under the dominion of death. We live under the dominion of dispossession. We live in terror of death, of having this bit of reality which we call ourselves taken from us. And then our whole existence becomes controlled by that terror. Love is impossible when we build our identities in this manner, because this terror becomes the controlling force in our lives, and our sense of self becomes enslaved to the fear of death. In the language of Jesus, if you lay up your treasures on earth, where the forces of death are at work, where moths and rust and things can be taken from you, your esteem is always vulnerable to loss and decay and damage. And so you lay up your treasures in another location. And if this is the sort of identity that is produced by the fear of death, an identity of possession, identity secured by grasping and clinging, then how are we to move into the identity of Jesus? An identity of emptying and letting go, setting us free from the fear of death and allowing us to take the downward path of love. To answer these questions, I'd like to continue with McGill's analysis. If an identity of possession is driven by a fear of loss and dispossession leading to sinful outcomes, what sort of identity should take its place? McGill looks for clues by closely examining the identity of Jesus in the Gospels. Where does Jesus get his identity? What is it based on, Jesus' identity? How did he form it? How does Jesus' identity differ from this identity of possession? According to McGill, the key notion is this: Jesus doesn't possess his identity. Rather, Jesus has what McGill calls an ecstatic identity, an identity that is not owned, but received as a gift. In the New Testament, this is McGill, in the New Testament portrayal of Jesus, nothing is more striking than the lack of interest in Jesus' personality. His teachings and miracles, the response to the crowd, the hostility to the authorities, his dying, his resurrection, these are not read as windows into Jesus' own subjective experience, feelings, insight, or growth. In other words, the center of Jesus' reality is not within himself. Everything that happens to him, everything that is done by him, including his death, is displaced to another context, and it's thereby reinterpreted. However, this portrayal is understood to be a true reflection of Jesus' own way of existing. He himself does not live out of himself. He lives, so to speak, from far beyond himself. Jesus does not confront his followers as a center which reveals himself. He confronts them as always, revealing what is beyond him. In that sense, Jesus lives with what I call an ecstatic identity. In all the early testimony to Jesus, this particular characteristic is identified with the fact that Jesus knows that his reality comes from the Father. Jesus never has his own being. He's continually receiving it. He's only as one who keeps receiving himself from God. As described here, McGill argues that the key to Jesus' identity is that Jesus doesn't possess his identity. Rather, Jesus experiences his identity as a gift. The center of Jesus' identity exists outside himself. In the language of David Kelsey, Jesus is living an eccentric existence, an existence that we are called to adopt and emulate. Kelsey describing the source here of the eccentric identity. The question, who are we as creatures, makes it clear that while I have my personal identity only in and through relations with other creatures of giving and receiving, my personal identity is not given to me by them in their assessment of me, and does not depend on their judgments of me. My personal identity is free of them, grounded elsewhere. I am radically given to directly only by the triune God. Your personal identity is defined by God alone and not by any creature. It is eccentrically grounded and defined. An eccentric identity is an identity grounded outside the boundary of the self. An eccentric identity, thus, is the opposite of McGill's identity of possession, whereas he describes it, an identity of possession, I have a boundary which marks the domain of my reality. As McGill observes, Jesus does not define his reality in this matter, but rather has an ecstatic or eccentric identity, one found outside of himself, grounded in the Father. Being eccentrically grounded, Jesus does not need to grasp at anything to secure his identity. Thus, Jesus' eccentric identity enables him to empty himself for others. Jesus' identity was formed in a way that liberated him from the slavery of the fear of death. Because Jesus did not own himself, he could not be dispossessed of himself. You could not damage, steal from, you couldn't compete with him because he did not own himself, but received it as gift. The fears and neuroses that push and pull our identities had no effect upon Jesus, and thus he was free to live spontaneously and generously. We see from Jesus' example, how the eccentric identity makes love possible. McGill explains here the dynamics of this Christ-like eccentric identity and illustrates how it overcomes the predicaments that I've been describing in these lectures. McGill, because I no longer live by a virtue of the reality by which I possess, by which I hold, which I master and I keep at my disposal. I'm free to share myself and all my possessions with others. Above all, I can be honest with others. I can be open before them. I do not have to draw a line to mark the boundaries of my reality where I begin and place a sign which says, keep out. I do not have to conceal my being from behind a wall in order to keep it mine, to prevent others from taking it from me. Since I never have myself, I can never be dispossessed of myself. In short, in all of my relations with other people, I am freed from that anxiety of having always to keep possession of my own reality in order to be. And so we become free from the slavery to the fear of death when we begin to form an eccentric identity. When we receive our identities as a gift, our basic and neurotic anxieties attenuate, creating the psychological capacity to empty ourselves in following Jesus' downward path. Perfect love has begun to cast out fear, and in dying to ourselves, we begin to live. Now let me pause here before I get into the last part about something that Winston brought up yesterday about belief in God and how belief in God can become nonviolent. You remember that from yesterday? So yesterday, if our identities are secured by our cultural worldviews, and then we begin defending those worldviews against out-group members, we become violent. So the question is, how can you be a religious person, have a worldview, and be hospitable to people who come from outside the Christian faith? And I said I'd try to visit this. I think it goes back to this idea of an eccentric identity. If God is experienced as a possession of the faith community, God has to be protected from being stolen from, damaged, affected. Does that make sense? If God is eccentrically received, it is not ever in the God. If God will, the Spirit will blow where the Spirit will blow, and we cannot control or contain God. We can't put a fence around God as something that needs to be protected. Then, if God is coming from the outside to us, and the faith community never has God, it never has to fear losing God, because God was never ours in the first place. And so that's my answer there. It is the way belief is held, either as a possession or eccentrically coming towards us as an act of gift and grace. I would also add here, you guys have probably been thinking through an answer to this, and it comes up a lot in my discussions about the book, is, well, I mean, why would anybody fear death? There's Heaven. That seems, you know what I mean? Why would any Christian fear death? And the answer there is as Freud had pointed out a long time ago, and many has pointed out since, is sometimes the belief in heaven is a manifestation of the fear of death. It's symptomatic of the fear of death that we're adopting the belief for consoling purposes, and because of that, the belief in heaven becomes another location of violence, because anybody who threatens to undermine or shake that faith causes me to be aggressive towards them. And so I would say that heaven can be believed in nonviolently if it is also eccentrically believed. If heaven is a gift that I don't control and I can't determine or know with any certainty, but is going to be a pure act of grace of God, then I become less aggressive about defending it because it's never been my possession to begin with. And so again, I would also argue there that the way the belief is held in the mind, either possession or gift, determines whether or not the belief in heaven is being used as a form of existential consolation, per Freud, or as an example of what I would call an authentic faith there. But that means, though, if heaven and God is coming to us eccentrically, that there is a provisionality about that, because I can't know for certain. It's not under my control to determine that with absolute confidence. And so our dogmatism is eroded a little bit because we're not in charge anymore of those things. So those are just some thoughts that are off the script that came up from yesterday. So let me end here with practices. Now all of this eccentric identity stuff might be fine in theory. In theory, an eccentrically grounded identity frees us from fear and creates a capacity to love. But how might such an identity be formed? What sort of practices would cultivate an eccentric identity? Now, space and time do not allow for an exhaustive discussion of practices, but I really think it's important to end these lectures on a practical note. How might we cultivate in ourselves, in our clients, in our faith communities, an eccentric identity that is emancipated from the fear of death? As mentioned above, a key shift in my estimation is to cultivate an identity that is experienced as gift rather than as a possession that must be protected against the prospect of death in its various guises. So if so, how are we to come to experience identity as gift? Again, a comprehensive answer can't be given right now, but a key part of the cultivation of an eccentric identity will be the practices of what David Kelsey has described as doxological gratitude. Let's start with gratitude. If we're trying to cultivate the experience of gift in our lives, then gratitude must be a central practice. As we know, positive psychologists have shown that gratitude is one of the strongest predictors of human happiness. And why is that? Because if we feel grateful, to feel grateful is to experience your life as a gift. It's an experience of grace and joy. Thus, the practices of gratitude, the cultivation of the experience of gift, creates the foundation of an eccentric identity. So let me be more specific. How does gratitude help us confront our slavery to the fear of death? To see this connection, I want to return back to the work of Brene Brown I mentioned in the first lecture. In Brown's work on vulnerability, she has discovered, somewhat paradoxically, a connection between joy and our fear of loss. When we experience deep joy, we are extraordinarily vulnerable. We fear that the joy will not last, that something tragic will happen that will rob us of happiness. Anyone who is a parent understands this. The birth of a child is a deep and a profound joy, but the birth of a child also introduces into our lives a chronic fear of loss. Our joy is fragile and precarious, tainted by the prospect of death. I have a friend who emailed me after the birth of his first child. And he asked me this question because I was a psychologist. You guys get these questions. You're a psychologist. You should know. And more often than not, I have no idea. I have no idea. I said to him, I was unaware of any empirical research on that topic. Increased death anxiety upon being a parent. I don't, anybody know? Somebody might cite a study here for me. But what he was describing to me has been my own experience in becoming a parent. In becoming a parent, I was never more joyful, but I was also never more afraid and cognizant of death. Because that little person, like your entire life is there. And it's like, if they get the sniffles, I just would catastrophize. And we like that, doesn't we play out? That's why I hate flying. You should be in my head while I'm flying. Like, this is it. This is the end. You know, I'm not. Does anybody do that on a flight? Yeah, In Brown's research, she's asked people about when they have felt the most vulnerable. Think about that. When have you felt the most vulnerable in your life and exposed to loss? And more often than not, what people have shared are experiences of joy. According to Brown, these are the sorts of experiences that make us feel that life is most vulnerable. These are when we are most vulnerable to the fear of death. From her research, standing over my children while they are sleeping. That's your most joy and your most fear. Acknowledging how much I love my husband or wife. Knowing how good I've got it. Loving my job. Spending time with my parents. Getting engaged. Going into remission. Having a baby. Being happy. Or falling in love. Joy and the fear of death go hand in hand. And in the face of this anxiety, Brown goes on to describe how many of us cope with this. In the face of all this exposure and invulnerability, many of us practice what she calls foreboding joy. That's what I'm doing on the plane. According to Brown, foreboding joy is a way of coping with our fears of loss by emotionally withdrawing from joy so that we might protect ourselves from loss and disappointment. Brown describes a continuum of strategies here, from rehearsing tragedy to perpetual disappointment. I'm like that. I kind of cultivate a low-grade pessimism, so like I'm always surprised by life. Is anybody like that? I'm always like, oh, this is going to be awful. That wasn't so bad, you know? That was great. I always do that. I always lowball. I'm perpetually disappointed and therefore surprised. We're always ruminating about worst-case scenarios, keeping our expectations very, very low. According to Brown, all these strategies share a central idea. This is her quote. We are trying to beat vulnerability to the punch. We don't want to be blindsided by hurt. We don't want to be caught off guard. So we literally practice being devastated or never move from a self-elected disappointment. Now, relevant for our purposes here, the antidote to this foreboding joy, this fear of death that's creeping into our lives, according to Brown, are what? The practices of gratitude. People who stay open to joy, despite all those risks, are the people who practice gratitude. As Brown summarizes, joy is a spiritual way of engaging with the world that's connected to practicing gratitude. More, Brown notes that from her research, participants say that joyfulness and gratitude are spiritual practices that are bound to belief in a human connectedness and to a power greater than us. That idea of joy, more and more I'm convinced that joy just cuts the knot of neurosis. Like, it's really hard to be neurotic when you're joyful. And I love that phrase in, I think it's Hebrews, right? Jesus carrying the cross, who for the joy set before him endured the shame of the cross. Because shame is a neurotic word. It wasn't the physical pain, who for the joy set for him was able to be humiliated. And so if you're going to take on the form of servant, if you're going to stand in a place of humiliation, how do you bear that neurotic shaming if you do not have for the joy set before you? So I've been meditating a great deal on that passage. This brings us now to the last bit on doxology. Gratitude, as we've just described it, is critical in casting out fear. But the gratitude we are speaking of here is more than just simple thankfulness. And this is where I think we get beyond positive psychology. Gratitude must also be doxological in nature. Doxological gratitude is gratitude experienced as worship. Now, this emphasis on doxology connects us back to our discussions about basic and neurotic anxieties, the anxieties associated with survival and self-esteem. And doxology addresses these anxieties in unique ways. Doxology and basic anxiety here. We become enslaved to basic anxiety when we think of possessions as mature resources that can be taken from us. Fearing that loss, we become selfish and stingy. But in worship, we come to experience all those things as gifts. And in worship, as we open our hands to receive everything as a gift from God, our sense of ownership attenuates. Those aren't your things. Before God, we own nothing and we receive everything as a gift. So doxology loosens our grip on our stuff, allowing us to let go of material possessions and acts of generosity and sharing. Doxological gratitude allows us to shift, in the words of Jesus, from laying up treasures on earth to laying up treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, nor thieves break in and steal. In doxology, our identities become eccentrically grounded, transferred to a location where death has no dominion. But as we previously noted, our slavery to the fear of death also has neurotic manifestations, less focused on material well-being and more upon our thirst for self-esteem, the desire to appear significant in our eyes and in the eyes of others. And doxological gratitude addresses these neurotic anxieties as well. As described in my first lecture, our pursuit of self-esteem is largely a game of trying to please and serve and win the approbation of cultural institutions, the principalities and the powers. We anxiously play the game of cultural heroics, trying to look, as we've described it earlier, as relevant, spectacular, or powerful. But if we reject this game, if we adopt the downward path of Jesus, how are we to bear up under what we have already called the shame-based fear of being ordinary? It is very, very difficult to reject the hero system of your culture. It is a difficult psychological and existential burden to go against the ideological flow, to reject how our culture defines the good life or the successful life. Now, what is going to sustain that effort across the lifespan? Gratitude alone is not going to get to the root of that neurotic anxiety. Essentially, if the cross is essentially a failure, how do you bear the neurotic shame of being considered a failure in the worldview of the culture? Does it make sense? You're going to have to get some ego strength to be a failure, to be a loser in the eyes of your family, in the eyes of the world, in the eyes of the academy, right? And this is why gratitude must be doxological in nature. As we described it in the last lecture, self-esteem is inherently idolatrous. Simple thankfulness, therefore, is not sufficient to root out the anxious core of the self-esteem project, the way we become beholden to the principalities and powers or relied upon our own talents, accomplishments, and abilities. Gratitude must be doxological in nature so that it can, in the act of worship, expose the self-esteem project as idolatry, as a route towards self-glorification, or service to the principalities and the powers. In this, doxological gratitude has a prophetic aspect. The practices of doxology, where we remember what is truly ultimate in our lives, calls into question and dismantles the death-driven ways that our culture pursues meaning, significance, value, and self-esteem. Worship allows us to go against the flow of cultural heroics. In worship, we no longer strive to justify our worth and our significance before the world. Rather, we eccentrically receive our identities from God. Efforts at self-justification are replaced with the experience of grace. We are worthy, not because of anything we have done or can do. We are worthy because of the gratuitous grace and the love of God. And in the face of that grace, our neurotic anxieties begin to fade. And perfect love begins to cast out fear. To bring this to an end, to summarize, the key practices that form an eccentric identity are thankfulness and worship. Doxological gratitude cultivates the experience of your life as a gift, and it prophetically rejects the idols of self-esteem enhancement proffered by the principalities and the powers of the culture. Where gratitude combats the basic anxieties associated with the loss of physical resources in sacrificial giving, worship combats the neurotic anxieties of trying to look successful in society's eyes. Consequently, it is not surprising in the epistles calls to ethical living. All of Paul's calls to ethical living, all of which boil down to the call to love, they begin and always end with expressions of thankfulness and rounds of praise and doxology. Because the practices of doxological gratitude support a life of love. These practices cultivate an eccentric identity, which in turn creates the psychological capacity to give our lives away in lives of love and service. And this love, as we've come to see it, is the quintessential sign of resurrection breaking into our lives. Love becomes the concrete sign that we become emancipated from our slavery to the fear of death. Love is the sign that we've been set free from the power of the devil, because perfect love has cast out fear. And so, to bring these lectures to a close, let us recall the words of Ecclesiastes. It's a theme for this weekend. There is a time to die and a time to live. Our general assumption is that we are currently alive. That's what time it is. That at some point in the future we will die. Life is now and death is in our future. But in many ways, the reverse is actually true. Many of us, perhaps most of us, are already under the power of death. As it says in Hebrews 2, we are enslaved to the fear of death. But Christ has come to set us free from this fear, to set us free to love, set us free from death so that we might experience life. As it says in 1 John 3:14, this is how we know. This is how we know we have passed from death to life. Because we love each other. It's time to love. It is time to live. Thank you.